So hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on the transport stage again. Appreciate those of you who stayed with us. Thank you very much for those who've joined us as well. Before the break, we had a really interesting session looking at the really high level, what's the vision for the future of transport. What we're now going to do is zoom in a little bit and look at the way we move people around cities and regions. The way we tailor our transport is really important. The same solutions potentially needed worldwide, but potentially need close tailoring depending on the solutions, the places they're being applied to, with their unique opportunities and their unique challenges. And I think a way of illustrating that, for me personally at least, is I started my journey in a village this morning, out in the sticks, one bus a day in, one bus a day out, really, really helpful for the public transport point of view. I then made my way to Milton Keynes, which is delightful, do go there. But one of the really exciting things about Milton Keynes is it's been really well thought through. The transport system, the roads have wide verges, very wide verges, in case a new transport solution was to come through in the future. So the way that the transport solutions of the future can be applied in Milton Keynes is potentially quite exciting. I then made my way by train into London, and obviously we've got a long and historic city history on that city, and it's a bit more organic, the growth, and perhaps applying those solutions would be a slightly different challenge, but a different opportunity as well. So this is a session to really explore those challenges, those opportunities. And our moderator today is Charlotte Warburton, Head of Transport and Public Sector Sustainability and Climate Lead at Deloitte.
Good morning. Isn't this exciting? Glad to see we've got another full house in transport. We're going to be dynamic, which is what transport needs to be. So we are going to hopefully have a third panellist guest joining us shortly. They are just dashing across the capital from Westminster. So let's hope transport does its job and gets him here on time, right? So I'm going to start with let the panel introduce themselves in terms of who they are and what they're representing before we get into the session. So Graham, if you want to start us off, please.
Thanks, Charlotte. Good morning, everybody. I was hoping to see a bit of the first session to get a bit of context, but too busy, so at least I managed to get a seat in this one. So yeah, I'm Graham Bannister. I'm a Sector Director at Mobility Ways. We help large organisations measure, reduce and report their commuting emissions. Commuting is 5% of the UK's total carbon footprint. We've obviously heard about how much transport is, so it's about 20% of all of transport emissions come from commuting. So we help large organisations get a hold of that and get a grip of it.
Thank you. Chris?
Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here. Nice to see you all. I'm Chris Hook. I lead sustainability for Uber. Hopefully many of you have heard of Uber, but we are a business that operates in cities all over the world. And my job is to try and ensure that we're on a path to reducing our emissions and our footprint through encouraging the uptake of things like zero emissions vehicles and other ways to move around cities. So I'm very interested to have this discussion about how we think about all the ways in which we can move people in the cities and regions in which we live.
Great, thank you. So before we get into it, I was just going to reflect on a couple of takeaways I took from yesterday. I spent quite a lot of time in the Catalyst area and thought it was really interesting. I think we might have our guest. We'll let him get mic'd up before we bring him down. I think for me, one of the three messages I took away, which applies to this topic, is hi. Duncan, do you want to go real time and just introduce yourself? So we're just getting going, doing intros, and what does your organisation represent in this space?
It represents lateness. Sorry, I'm a bit late. Duncan Walker, Chief Exec and founder of a company called Skyport. We do two things predominantly. We fly autonomous, beyond visual line of sight drones. That's sort of 25 kilogram aircraft that can fly 150 miles, delivering medical samples, surveillance and inspection. We deliver to ships, humanitarian stuff. And we also build what we call vertiports, which are heliports for the new passenger carrying drones, so all electric vehicles, which will be certified next year and operational in places like Dubai and the US by 2025.
Thank you. So to recap, I think what I took away from yesterday was three things. You'll all have different views because we all have different perspectives and there was a lot talked about. But one is actually we need to speed up what we're doing. So in the context of moving people out in cities and regions, how are we speeding up how we're decarbonising the journey and improving the service and actually doing that collectively? So that's something we're hoping to explore today. For me, it was the second was around stimulating greater demand and changing of behaviours of customers, be it organisations and citizens. One of the key takeaways I took was, you know, the gap between saying and doing is still fairly significant, and carbon is not really in the top 5 priorities of our citizens. So how do we apply that lens in a transport perspective? And then the third was the circularity aspect. And when Chris Skidmore was talking about his zero emission report, actually thinking about that from the circularity lens. So how do we optimize the materials and the uses we have rather than creating more? So putting that together, you know, in the context of moving people around cities and regions, how do we rethink transport and mobility? How do we maximize what we've got, maybe reduce ridership, that's controversial, and green the mobility service? So the first question I'd like to start with is big picture. So gents, what do you think the experience should be for passengers, citizens, moving across cities and regions in the future? Graham, do you want to go first?
Yeah. So I think in a net zero future, so you mentioned experience, so I'd kind of keep the theme of ease, so I'd go for equitable.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be available to all in society, and I think that's both from an affordability perspective, but I think that's also in terms of how it's delivered. And what I mean by delivery is it's app agnostic. So obviously we'll hear from Uber in a second, but I think it needs to be something that it doesn't matter which delivery mechanism the user wants, it's available for them and they get the same consistent level of service. So that's equitable. And then related to service, I would say it's elevated.
Yeah.
It needs to be elevated. So we need to be thinking about continual improvement in services. And that comes from data-driven. We have to be data-driven even more. We have to really, really go for that in terms of its monitoring and evaluation, so that we actually get to the place where the right infrastructure, and the infrastructure needs to be different in cities as compared to regions, and we absolutely understand that, but the right infrastructure is delivered to allow people to more easily move to active and shared transport.
Thanks, Graham. And so, Chris, building from that, like when we met earlier, we talked from an Uber lens, not just about passengers, but also businesses. How do you see the future of people and businesses moving around within cities and regions from an Uber
Yeah,
lens?
I think just building on that, I mean, people want it to be easy, right?
Yeah.
Like people being able to get from where they are to where they need to be is a crucial part of our economy. It's a crucial part of people's everyday lives. It needs to be as effortless as possible. And I think that's about doing the work to try and connect the system up, and then to do the work to make that transport have the least possible impact. So things like moving to a mass adoption of electric vehicles, but more adoption of active travel, connecting different modes of transport together in a more seamless way, I think is allowing people to take away some of the complicated decision making that often is involved in how do I get from my village near Milton Keynes to Olympia, and to make that as easy for people as possible.
So taking the whole system view,
I think
right?
so, yeah.
And what do you think, we're going to go down a rabbit hole, we'll come back out in a minute, but you know, what do you think are the things we struggle with today in getting that whole system view?
I think we struggle with the join-ups often, in terms of, you know, there's lots of technology that's been deployed over the last, 5 or 10 years that helps people make plans, but they can't pay for the journey in one consistent way. They don't necessarily have all the information at their disposal around the trade-offs they're making between time, convenience, impact on the planet, etc. And so I think there's more information that can be shared, and then there's more integration that can happen to make those join-ups as seamless as possible.
Thank you. And Duncan, from your lens, how do you see the future of movement between cities and regions evolving?
Yeah, I think so. From an aviation perspective, aviation is obviously one of the biggest contributors to carbon pollution as a form of transportation. And what does it need to be to reduce that those carbon emissions? Well, it needs to be convenient. People aren't going to make a choice altruistically most of the time unless it is convenient. If it's a function of going somewhere that's going to take twice the time or twice the cost, people aren't going to do it realistically. So it needs to be convenient predominantly, and it needs to have a business case that meaningfully closes both for the provider and for the user of the service. So when we're thinking about passenger transportation by drone in cities, is that a great way to reduce congestion, reduce pollution. If you're going somewhere which has already got an existing tube network which is very efficient, not really.
Yeah.
It's not. There's zero emission in flight, but there's emission in producing the vehicles, in producing the infrastructure. Where we focus is those connections in cities which have poor ground infrastructure. So it is inconvenient, difficult, and requires taxis or coaches, things which are contributors to pollution significantly. And also in suburban or rural environments where the ground infrastructure is poor, either because of the topography, mountains, lakes, rivers, or because the density of traffic is relatively low, so it doesn't warrant high-speed rail links or whatever the alternatives are. So for me, it's consumer convenience and also a business case which is efficient from the operator's perspective and cost saving from the user's perspective.
Yeah, okay. So I think there's lots in there of painting the picture of the future. I suppose now what I'm interested in is how do we get to action? So, from your perspectives, what more do we need to do you think, to come together, look at this holistic view and actually get to the point of action where we can make these futures happen? So what do we need to do differently? What's the greater role of technology and innovation? What more do you need from regulation? How do we change behaviours? I don't know who wants to start.
Yeah, I'll have a go at that. The reason I'm late is because I came from a meeting with the aviation minister at Department for Transportation about the implementation of drones and passenger air taxis in the UK. So I sit on a panel called the Future Flight Group, which is great. Government panels aren't really my thing, but it's action focused, so it's okay. I also sit on the same in Dubai, where we are implementing infrastructure there for the same thing. The answer to the question is we need policy to be both highly aligned with the future and where we want to get to, but also highly action focused. The difference between the approach in Dubai and the approach in the UK is stark. They make things happen at frightening and lightning speed. You need land availability, they either own it or they'll get it for you. You need electrification of the sites, it's done within an instant. You need policy change, they'll do it straight away. That is not representative of many other places in the world, but that's what we need if we want direct, quick action. And moving towards that model in a highly democratic environment like the UK or the US is quite a challenge.
And do you think, Duncan, you're at the point from your perspective that you can't take any more action till that's achieved? And I asked that slightly loadedly because there was a comment made yesterday on the Catalyst stage by one of the ministers around the cost of inaction from industry and consumers today, whilst we're waiting for policy, is almost as costly as not having the right policy.
Yeah, I'll answer it in a slightly different way. If you look at how I allocate the capital I have in my business and the people I have in my business, it's those places where there is direct action. So I have more people in Singapore than I have in London. London's HQ, London's where I started the business, but I now have more people in Singapore than London because they make stuff happen faster over there.
Clarity, right? Yeah. You've got clarity of incentives. Chris, do you want to come in?
I think regulation has a massively important role to play in terms of ensuring that everything moves together and we don't get pockets where places are running ahead, services are great, and other places are left behind. And it provides that platform for businesses to invest with a degree of certainty. I think in certain parts of the transport ecosystem, I think mostly about passenger cars at the moment, for example, a lot of the hardware technology is there, right? Like we've seen a lot of investment from manufacturers, not as much as we ultimately need to by any means, but the wheel has started moving. We've been working on this problem for the last 5 years. The difference between when I started thinking about how we electrify Uber's business in London, for example, and where we are now is night and day. But that is still only the beginning of that S-curve. We're still in the early adopter phase. The trajectory is encouraging, but it's not getting us to where we want to ultimately be, probably at the pace that we need to go, to come back to your original point about speed.
Yeah.
And so I think regulation can be, and policy in general, is an incredibly important catalyst. And then helps people build with confidence for the direction that we're going and ensure that we're not leaving communities behind or certain parts of the country behind whilst others race ahead.
Great. Graham, do you want to build?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a big element of policy, but it's also massively behaviour change. It's just the change is not happening. So we have to be bolder. We have to be more ambitious. You have to reflect on where we are, particularly with transport. The emissions are not going down. We have a transport decarbonisation plan that was launched in July of 21. That has now been seriously watered down into, I think it's called Climate Budget Delivery Plan, I believe it's called, launched in March. If you want to know more about the sort of watering down, I definitely have a look at CREDS. So that's the Centre for Research into Demand Energy, lots of acronyms, something like that, CREDS, and Decarbonate. They've done a paper called Reverse Gear, so I'd look at that. So there's a massive problem here. You know, we're watering down policy. We're not getting into the behaviour change piece. Thankfully, from a Mobility Ways perspective, we've been doing behaviour change for 20 years. There are still some things in the carbon budget delivery plan which relate to what we do. So an element is Commute Zero, which is about working with employers to encourage long-term change in employee travel, looking at support, research support and encouragement. Is there any money? I've no idea, because how do you encourage without money? You need incentives. And the second part is about, just where cars are concerned, increasing car occupancy. But again, we have a lack of ambition in this country. That part of the plan talks about 700,000 tons of CO2 savings by 2033. Take France, they're looking at 4.5 million tons of CO2 saved through car sharing every year.
But just building on that a little bit more, right? So lift sharing, new business models, behavioural nudging. Can you give me a bit more, like dig into the detail? How do you think we incentivise citizens to change their behaviours?
Well, we take a view that employers are a massive component part of it. Again, thinking about our niche a little bit in terms of commuting, 20% of all transport emissions, that's because of people going to work, to their place of employment. In this country, we don't have, as they do in other countries, a requirement for the employer to fund or part fund travel. It's the requirement of us to get ourselves to work. Now, thankfully, the companies that we work with several hundred, principally UK, so NHS Trust, universities, local authorities. They recognise that they need to do something. They need to put something into the pot. So whilst they're not paying for, me to have travel across London, whatever it might be, they recognise that they need to put incentives in place. Yeah. So that could be also then feeding its way into policy in terms of the actual company's policy. But it's then things about like preferential parking. It can be incentives, which can be free food, free drinks. It can be cash. We have some clients who literally stick cash in a pot and say, car sharers at the end of the month, top car sharer, you get 150 quid. Right. So it's a different way of doing it. Perhaps other countries are doing it in a better way by actually just paying for public transport, because that's the best way to do it. But we're getting there. We're doing some things, and we're helping to kind of drive employers to do more.
And Chris, from an Uber perspective, because obviously you have like the lift sharing option in the app, how much are you seeing of that kind of uptake for Uber, and what's your perspectives on maybe driving more of it?
Yeah, and certainly in the long term, we think the model is a shared and electric model. We have a shared rides product. We had been growing that before the pandemic. For obvious reasons, we shut it down during the pandemic. It's now coming back. And that's about using our technology and the size of Uber's network to try and find ways to help people be more efficient. The incentive there is cost. Yeah. Right? If you've got two people who are going broadly the same direction, and we can use the technology to match you, the ride becomes much, much cheaper. And it's helping to bridge gaps and fill gaps where, maybe public transit networks aren't in operation. Some of what we're talking about here in terms of parts of the country where we don't have those strong infrastructure, or we want to fill the gaps between nodes. Those shared products can really work. But people resist doing that if it's inconvenient or expensive. Yeah. Okay. And so trying to make it as convenient as possible and as cheap as possible is the real secret.
Thank you. And Duncan, from your perspective, some exciting new ways of travelling around between cities and regions. What do you see as kind of the key barriers to get the customer to change?
I think it's exactly right. It's price and convenience, right? And I think there's also a sort of weird bit of psychology about it as well, in the sense that, am I prepared to share transportation with other people? Absolutely, yes. I get the train every day, bus, whatever. I sit on aeroplanes. Am I prepared to get an Uber with other people? No, it freaks me out. I don't want to do it. I don't know why, but it just feels a bit weird. So I think there's sort of the price and convenience bit, and there's also the education piece around it about why the other three aren't serial killers probably, and we have the luxury, and there's a new industry as well. So when we're pitching the industry, it's very much about ride sharing. It's very much about load factors, utilization. That's the way aircraft, in fact, most transportation work on load factors. So I think there's also the marketing pieces, like how do you convince people who are used to a taxi in particular, or an air taxi being a private form of transportation, how do you change that mindset to prove that it can be a nice way to save money and carbon emissions?
Yeah, similar experience. I was never into ride sharing, and then I found myself in the States in a sleepy village, booked a taxi, and it turned up and had 4 other people in it, and I was like, this was not my taxi. But supply and demand, there weren't enough taxis in the city, so I had to either get the ride share or I'd have to walk. So I think there's also an element of supply and demand in all of this, right? Takes me to my next point, but if we were to think about the circularity aspect and optimizing the capacity we have versus putting more public transport and more cars on the roads, how do you think we get better integration between the modes so that we are encouraging passengers to use the capacity that is there? And how do we move from a competing for customers to looking at the holistic model to give the best service to them? I don't know who wants to go first on that one.
Yeah, I'll forget it. I think reliability is absolutely key. When I think about a modal shift in my journey, that point of friction is key to my decision making. If I know I'm going somewhere which has got a fantastic supply of taxis outside all the time, or I'm somewhere where the trains work perfectly. I was in South Korea 2 weeks ago. The trains are clockwork. They're incredible. And that kind of sort of multimodality, do I take the train and then a car, or do I take the car a much further direction? It's a very different mindset where you know things work really well versus where I'm not convinced if I'm going to be able to find a taxi. The train's often delayed. There's traffic jams all the time. So, and I don't know how you solve that because it's a much more macro problem. But reliability and smooth customer journey for me is the way that you can really drive acceptance of the customer acceptance of multimodal journeys.
And I suppose my interest, so I agree with that, but what I'm interested in is how do you get better join up across the modes so the modal operators are talking and sharing so that actually as a customer I can go to one app and you as modal operators can give me my best option, not the best option for your modes. Like, how do we do that?
I think the greatest innovation of smart cities that I have seen is the ability to use my credit card across all forms of London transportation. Yeah. It's fabulous. It's not that hard. It feels like it's not that hard, which is probably why it's a great product. It probably is very hard because everyone's putting their hand in the pot as to how much they've provided versus another provider. Chris will have a much more sophisticated answer than I do because the software backing of it all. But it's those kind of easy touch points, right? If I know that I'm going to use my same credit card all over London all day and I don't need to worry about whether I'm saving money or not because the system works it out at the end of the day, that kind of customer convenience really is a key driver for me. Chris will have a much better
I agree with
perspective.
that on the contact. I forgot what it's like to have to buy a bus ticket, and it's just going to other cities where that doesn't exist. It's become a much more painful experience. So I completely agree with that. We've recently been working a lot in Uber in the UK around we're calling Uber Travel, which is to do kind of what you're describing, trying to bring other forms of transport into the app, allow people to use the account they already have, the payment details they already have, but book things other than a car. So, you can get a taxi, but you can also rent a car, you can book a train, you can book a coach, you can book a flight, you can use a bike or a scooter, where those are allowed. You can go on the Thames Clipper here in London. The theory behind that is that there are lots of different circumstances in which one or many of those things are going to be right for the individual who's making that journey. But our point of difference is to be the the single interface, to not have to have accounts across all of those different things, to not have to make your own complicated decisions, and to try and be that aggregator of those services. Is there still a long way to go in terms of making that seamless? For sure.
Yeah.
But it does feel like it's useful to try and create spaces in which people can join journeys up and think about how they go long distances particularly, and not have to rely on their own personal car or a car that's going to cause a lot of emissions to get from point A to point B, particularly if they're moving between cities. As you go across the country, a car is very rarely going to be the most environmentally friendly way to get there, even if it is at the moment often, unfortunately, the most convenient.
And so picking up on your point of you're on a journey, there's still a long way to go, what would be helpful to accelerate on that journey quicker?
I think it's the ability for those things to be more seamlessly integrated. I think we can do the work and should do the work to make it feel more effortless as a consumer. That's what a great consumer experience is about. But it's still pretty complicated in the back end. And so the extent to which we can move to a more and more integrated network, I think it makes it easier and easier for people to use it in a seamless way and have the kind of experience we were just describing in terms of getting across London.
Great, thank you.
I think sort of building on that, I'm reverting back to the kind of what does the future look like. I talked about elevated and it being data-driven evaluation type stuff. And I think, there is a heck of a lot of data out there. Not all of it is open. Some of it's open, but it's not in the same place. So we've got to get the bus data, taxi data, bike sharing data, all the car sharing companies, car rental companies, all the data needs to be in a consolidated point for anybody to access. And I mean anybody to access, people who are a lot smarter than me, who can build scenarios, build models. We do quite a bit of what we call scoping with our clients. And from that, we ascertain the potential within an organization to travel more sustainably. And that does lead actually to conversations sometimes with public transport operators, because we can see clusters of people that are just outside of scope for going on public transport. It's not quite, you've got a job on your hand if it's going to be an hour on the bus and 20 minutes in the car. It's too much of a gap for somebody to actually seriously consider the bus. But we can start to see clusters that says, actually, public transport operator, maybe if you can just do a bit of rerouting, you can pick up all those people. And then we can talk to the employer and say, you might want to incentivize a little bit the bus travel for that, to get those people working, to get that running. We've got other clients where they've actually put in additional mobility service operators, new services, new lines that actually are doing the job where public transport isn't. So data, getting it all together, and then getting smart people to actually work out what the hell to do with it.
Couple of builds for me on that one. If I start with helping, you were talking about helping organisations to think about their routes differently. What do you see as support that the local authorities need? Because I can imagine you go to them, have those conversations, but does it get actions? What support do you think we need to give more of?
They need to come to events like this.
Yep.
There's not enough of them here. I think I've spoken to 2 so far in 1.5 days, and there's 1,500. I'm just talking in the UK context, but there's 1,500 councils, so there's not enough of them here. I think, actually, there's lots of things that they can do that they're not doing. I mean, again, UK specific, but who's heard of the workplace parking levy in Nottingham? That's 10 years ago that was launched. Has any other council done it? No. Why not? Oh, it's difficult. Yeah, but this is why we need to do it, because it is difficult. You need to take action. You need to be bold. You need to be ambitious. So I think there's a lot of kind of looking for private companies to help local authorities. Local authorities need to help themselves.
Right.
And then call on the services of fantastic companies to then deliver the right solutions for their city or their region.
And so then, Graham, my second point, but open to all three of you, data to customers, letting them understand the impact of their journeys in terms of carbon footprint. Heard a lot yesterday around we need to give people more data so that they can see up front the impact of their choices, be it food, be it travel. What's your perspective on that in terms of pushing more data to consumers? Because there's loads of apps out there, not necessarily integrated, it's almost too much choice. How do you think we address that one?
This guy can go first on data. Come on.
Being presented as some sort of data expert, and that's certainly a long way from
You've got the most data.
lot of amusement internally if that was people knew that was the case. So I think helping people be informed is clearly important. I think you need to think hard about how you do that. Otherwise, it's just not helpful and useful. We've been thinking a lot about how we surface through the Uber app the emissions associated with the trips that you take in a way that is useful to help people make choices and informative, but not just more noise in the system. There's already a lot of decision factors in there. So I think a lot of that is available, certainly available for individual companies to use, but you should be conscious about how you're sharing it in a way that actually helps inform decision making, not just is another thing to factor into already a complicated decision. The other way to think about data, to come back a little bit on the point you were making about local authorities, is more in aggregate. So we've been running a project, for example, with 3 boroughs here in London where we share more aggregated data in terms of journeys that are happening across the city and demand for electric vehicle charging, where we're seeing drivers transition to EVs. We've seen a big uptake in EVs. We've got big goals in terms of how quickly we want to electrify all of the drivers that are living and working in London. That puts demands on the ability to charge, particularly, and we've heard about this in the last panel, a lot of people don't have access to charging at home. They need public infrastructure. It is the job of local authorities often to provide that. We can play a role, we think, in surfacing that demand, how it's changing, how it's likely to evolve in a way that's useful to inform decision making at the more aggregated level. We've built a tool that allows you to understand where that demand is manifesting and how it's likely to change over time, and funded some pilots to try and put some of that infrastructure in the ground in some of the communities in this city which are furthest behind in terms of infrastructure today. So there's kind of 2 levels. There's the individual level, sure, but then there's also looking at things at a more systems level and helping people make decisions on that basis, I think.
And are you finding, Chris, so you're talking about sharing it in communities with local authorities and their citizens, are you also finding greater connectivity with other organisations that you're working alongside?
Absolutely, yeah. So part of it is working with the public sector, but it's also, we work with a lot of private partners who are also putting infrastructure in the ground, for example. The thing that we can bring to that is often the insight into where we think infrastructure is going to get used if it's sited in particular places. We have a partnership with BP Pulse, for example. They own the assets, they operate the infrastructure. We're trying to ensure that those assets get used as much as possible, and so we think very carefully about where you might site them, so that it makes sense for all the different factors. So yes, certainly a partnership in the private sector side as well as on the public sector side.
Great, thank you. Duncan, do you have any builds?
Yeah, I think data on the micro level, from my perspective, is virtually useless. I don't think you change people's behavior unless you provide them additional convenience. I'll give you an example. My electricity bill, OVO Energy, I have 2 choices. I can go with whatever plan A, or I can go with the green plan. The green plan is 3% more expensive, but it uses renewable energy. Click that every time. Easy, doesn't require any benefit for me. Happy to pay the extra 3% to offset carbon emissions and feel like I'm doing something good for the environment. If I get data coming in saying, you're going to save 0.01 tons of carbon emissions by taking the tube, not the train. I don't know what that means. Like, is that great? Are all the African rhinos now saved? Or is it completely irrelevant to everybody? And 2, I don't mean this in a bad way. I don't think people care. I think people prioritize their busy lives and convenience. Unless the difference is so stark between choice A and B, you're going to go down the convenient route. So I think data is much more important on a macro level to change behavioral norms without the consumer knowing about it than it is on the micro level. Like the Elizabeth line recently opened. My choice is, let's say, a taxi or a train into Bond Street. I now take that train into Bond Street because it's way more convenient and it's 10% of the price. That, I don't know whether it was sophisticated enough back in the day when Crossrail was conceived, but that's a very clear data-driven choice. There is X amount of traffic between London Heathrow and Bond Street. It is a huge infrastructure cost that takes many, many years. but the change in behavior for many people is significant enough to warrant that infrastructure investment, not only from a sort of pound return, but also from the environmental benefit of doing that. So I think, micro data, very, very little impact from my perspective. I think using that macro data to change behavioral norms is the way to really make an impact.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to the floor, right? So if people haven't been asking questions with Slido, please do. I'm going to take a couple that we've got in already. So we've got just under 10 minutes. We've actually answered some without looking at them, which is helpful. But the first question, and pop your hands up, panel, who wants to take it. If 20% of transport emissions are created from work commutes around the transport, what does the transport sector need to do to engage more with construction around city planning? Graham, maybe do you want to go first with that one?
Just say that again, sorry.
What more does transport need to do to engage with the construction sector around city planning if 20% of the transport emissions are coming from work commutes?
Well, I think I mentioned at the beginning, it's about, we've got to look for continual improvement in the services, and there is a pyramid of mobility that I think everybody gets. It's walking, wheeling, shared transport, and then you're into private car. So cities understand that. Cities want that to happen. To Duncan's point about the macro level data, that's really important to kind of then drive through those trends into what is constructed. I think it's been disappointing to see things like the Active Travel Fund. The budget for that has been cut, but there's still plenty that can be done. And I think monitoring and evaluation what's going on in the cities and seeing how many people are now cycling, and then recognizing that, and then seeing where the points where it's not working so well, talking to people about talking to those who are cycling those routes and actually saying to them, how can we make this better for you? And then importantly, putting in the action. I think planning takes too long. We need to speed everything. You mentioned at the beginning, we need to speed everything up. If we see an opportunity, it needs to be, there almost needs to be a fast-track process, I would say, where construction's concerned in cities to get these things done. React on feedback, get a great feedback loop going, and get the stuff sorted.
I was going to say, Duncan, you'll have a view.
Yeah, actually my background is all construction and development before I started doing this. I think things like that are quite interesting, right? 20% of emissions come from construction traffic within a city. Okay, it's quite an interesting stat. What are you going to do about that, right? Do you change the routing of construction traffic? Do you change the hours that they can use? No, you still have the same trucks coming in. I think you've got to look at what the root cause of that traffic is, and it's a lack of innovation in the construction sector. Construction sector is building blocks of flats, office blocks, the same way they were building them 100 years ago. It's nuts. Name another industry that's that archaic. I'll tell you two, insurance and law, but most aren't that terrible, right?
Sorry if there's any lawyers or insurers in the room.
It's weird to me that such a big sector is so lacks so much innovation, and I think with all the focus on sort of net zero and carbon emissions, and this should be led by government as well as industry. If you target the root cause of that rather than the symptom of it, symptom being traffic and emissions, root cause being lack of innovation in the construction sector, what can you do to reduce the number of trucks required into the construction centre? Well, you can do modular construction. You can use precast concrete, not poured on-site concrete. Traffic is, and I have construction sites at the moment, part of the problem is those concrete trucks, because they have to keep whirring, sit there idle on site for 2 or 3 hours at a time, pumping out diesel. Can't do anything about it. That has to keep whirring, otherwise the concrete set goes off in the back. It's about scheduling, it's about innovation, it's about targeting the root cause of some of these problems, not the symptom of some of these problems.
Thanks. Couple more to go. Bear with me while I just open the iPad. A bit of a topical one. Given France has banned short-haul domestic flights under 2.5 hours where there's a land-based alternative, where do you think we should be going from a UK lens? Should we be doing the same?
Should we let the
aviation
guy?
But he wants to talk
about
about
yeah.
water.
Yeah.
Yes, you think we should?
Yeah, but I absolutely think we should, but I also think the influence is consumer choice. I find it a bit weird because I would never take an aeroplane where I can get a 2.5-hour train or a 3-hour train.
But the France point is they've banned it, haven't they? So they've taken away the choice.
Yeah, great, do it. I think
Then you think we should run
I
that
think it makes
down
sense,
here.
providing, and this is a massive proviso, the alternative works.
Yeah.
Right? If you've got a train that has 40% time reliability, that is not an alternative. If you have a train that has 98% reliability, Japan 99.5, Dubai 99.9, South Korea 99.8, perfect. Then you've got an alternative. If you've got one that is beholden to unionized staff as to whether they're going to get out of bed in the morning, that's not a viable alternative.
Chris, a specific question for you. Is Uber looking to incorporate micro-mobility more heavily as a way to diversify travel habits, reduce congestion and reduce emissions?
Short answer is yes.
Yep. Can we have a bit more detail, please?
So I can add a little bit to that. We have a partnership with Lime, some of you will know. We offer, therefore, bikes and scooters through the app as an alternative. And we do that in a lot of cities across the world, and we're looking to grow that portfolio. We just launched a new partner in cities in Latin America. We think there's a huge opportunity to shift some of those shorter city centre journeys, particularly in parts of the world where, frankly, the weather allows, to more active modes of transport, and they're very popular. Now, obviously, there's things that those companies need to get right in terms of regulation and safety and how they operate, and there's been a lot of progress, I think, in that over the last few years. But we certainly see it as a big part of the solution. And when we talk about our goals to be 100% zero emissions trips in 2030, we mean a combination of electrified passenger cars and other forms of transport, but also bikes and scooters.
Thank you. 5 minutes ago, any more questions, get them in, otherwise I'm going to ask the last one here. You've all alluded to the UK's lack of vision and speed to do this. If you were individually writing the UK's new zero carbon transport strategy, what one aim, policy or regulation would you include?
Great question.
Yeah. Go on, Graham, you go first.
I think there's going to be lots of things, but I think,
Your top one.
from our, again, from Mobility Ways kind of view, it's really working with businesses. If you look at what's going on, I mentioned France already. France has been mentioned twice now, but, France have any company over 100 employees needs to have a mobility plan, a designated mobility manager. It's reportable, it's actionable. Spain are following the same. Any company with over 500 employees needs to have a sustainable travel plan. We need that.
So it's mandating that companies have
Mandated.
specific mobility.
Yeah, and
plans.
then obviously we've got the corporate CSRD,
Yeah.
the EU directive that's come through. Now, I think there's 10,000 non-EU companies that will be affected by that, about 10% of them being UK. It's coming. It's the directives, the pace of where it's coming is coming. I would just love the UK to just go, okay, we accept all of this stuff is happening. This is what we have to do, and take note of what's going on in the rest of the world, and actually mandate.
So learn from others and do it
Learn from
quickly.
others, take best practice.
So Chris, from your lens, what one policy or reg, if you could have a wish list, be king for a day, what would be the one you would ask for?
I think the thing that I think is most crucial for our success and for the pace at which we move is the capacity to deliver. We often hear commitments made around funding, policies, sometimes quite long-term goals, bans on certain things at some distance in the future. The piece that often feels like it's missing is investment in the teams on the front line who need to deliver it. And I'll go back to that example I had before in terms of the work we're doing with boroughs here in London in growing infrastructure. The key barrier often is not a willingness or even, frankly, the capital. The money is often there. It is a capacity and an expertise to execute the programs at pace.
Yeah.
And if you can give people big checks, but if you don't have the people on the ground who know what they're doing to deliver it, things take a long time. So I would
turning the
focus
strategy into action,
I would
right?
focus a lot on capacity building, particularly at the local level.
Great, thank you. Duncan,
Yeah,
if you were
my-
king for a day, what would you have
I'd do a lot of other things first if I was king for the day,
on
to be
this
honest.
topic?
It's a bit of a build on Chris's, actually. I would give much greater autonomy to planning authorities and a much bigger incentive on them to rapidly decide on critical infrastructure for new transportation. It is insane that it takes 6 to 9 months to get planning consent to put street charges in. Why? I mean, I don't understand it. But all of that efficiency, all of that convenience, it's embedded in the quality of the core infrastructure that you have. Tunnels, railway bridges, charging infrastructure, whatever it is, that for me is the key driver for utilization and convenience, and it's incredibly difficult to execute on. So change the rules and incentivize planning authorities to make decisions quicker and give them more power to enable that infrastructure change.
Great, thank you. We're out of time. If we can give the panel a round of applause. Thank you for your time. I hope you enjoyed it and enjoy the rest of your day.